Throughout its history, the NBA doesn't really have a long list of playoff Cinderella stories. You have the 8th-seeded 99 Knicks, who made the finals in a lockout-shortened season, and the 6th-seeded 95 Rockets, who are the lowest seed to ever win an NBA title. However, a storyline has emerged over the second half of this season that has loomed over everything. The possibility of one of the weirdest seasons ever, creating the most dangerous, low-seeded team in league history. A team that, with its best player healthy, was the best team in the conference, that has multiple NBA champions on the roster, has 2 All-NBA level players, a ton of role guys with playoff experience, and one of the best offenses in the league when fully healthy, and that as a play-in team, has better odds to win the NBA title right now than the 1 seed in their own conference. But is also a team whose best defender was a midseason trade acquisition that is yet to play this season and might play his first game during the playoffs, whose best shooter is out for the year, with questionable spacing and defense, limited size in the front court, and pretty much zero continuity or chemistry after one of the biggest trades in league history shook up their roster in the middle of the season. Yet despite all of that, is still considered as legit of a title contender as nearly any other team in the league. And weirdly, this is the second season in a row that we've had a play-in team, a 7 seed, with a legitimate chance to win a title, with last year being the Lakers. And as I mentioned in the intro, a 7 or 8 seed has never won the NBA title, but I'm going to tell you why that might change this year. Now, typically what we've come to expect out of the 7 or the 8 seed is either an up-and-coming young team like Memphis last year or Minnesota this year that's exciting, that's new to the postseason, but probably isn't going to make much of a run, or a team that's just kind of stuck in the middle and an average team like the Blake Griffin Pistons from a couple of years ago. But in either of those scenarios, you're not really afraid of those teams. But in this one, we've seen teams actively avoid matching up with Brooklyn in the first round. And anytime you have a team as talented and with as much potential in the postseason as Brooklyn as a 7 seed, something had to go wrong. And obviously, it's been an incredibly weird season to this point. Between injury issues to KD, Kyrie being in and out of the lineup, the Harden trade, the Simmons stuff, all this has combined to make it, honestly, one of the most unique and one of the weirdest seasons in league history, but they could do something historic to end it. So let's make the case and begin with the most obvious part of this. Whenever you have Kevin Durant on your basketball team, almost irrelevant of who else is on the team and who else is on the floor, you are a serious threat to win any individual basketball game. And when you extend that to a series, your odds get lower if your team overall is just worse than the team that you're playing. But in general, you feel pretty good when Kevin Durant is playing as well as he has this season and he's on your team going into a playoff series. And if you need proof of that, just think about what happened in the postseason last year against the eventual champion Milwaukee Bucks without Kyrie, with a hobbled Harden that was like 50% of himself, and the rest of the guys out there really weren't all that impressive, and they still were about as close as you could be without actually winning the series to advancing to the conference finals. And then you can extend that out, of course, to Kyrie Irving as well. When you think about what postseason basketball looks like, what the playoffs start to resemble, it comes down to the last 8 minutes, the last 5 minutes, the last 2 minutes of games. And I've watched a ton of Nets this year. And if they are right, they are potentially the best fourth quarter team in the league. They have a ton of crazy comebacks this year. They have a ton of crazy fourth quarters this year. And what it comes down to, especially once defenses start to tighten up, once spacing starts getting a little bit tighter in the postseason, you need guys that can come down the floor and get you a decent shot every single time down. Even if it doesn't go in, even if it's not a fantastic shot, you at least get a good look at the rim. And the Nets have 2 guys, potentially the best duo for that specific scenario in the entire league. Now, they aren't on the same level as Phoenix, for example, in that category as a team, nor is that a guarantee that they'll be awesome late in games in the playoffs. But when you rank what you would most like to have going into a postseason, late game shot creation is very high on the list. And think about that skill set that those 2 guys have in comparison to some of the other teams they could possibly be matching up with in the postseason. It looks like if they win their play-in game, they're going to be playing Boston in the first round. You might rather have Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown late in games rather than Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving. But if you would rather have those guys, it's pretty close. Same thing with the Miami Heat with Jimmy Butler. Same thing with Milwaukee with Giannis and Chris Middleton. Same thing with Philadelphia with Embiid and maybe Harden. Even if you would choose one of those other duos over KD and Kyrie, it's very, very close, and that is incredibly unique for such a lower seeded team. And it's not just the individual scoring brilliance of those two guys, because when the Nets are making shots, when their other guys, their role players, are spacing the floor well, and Bruce Brown is cutting to the rim, and Andre Drummond is getting offensive rebounds, their offense can take off at any time. You're never safe in any of these games. You could be up by 15 in the second half, and they can reel that back in. Even though their defense isn't great, which we're going to talk about, they always are just kind of looming because of the offensive firepower that they have. And that's such a unique challenge for a 7 or an 8 seed to present to a higher seeded team. Typically, if you're the 1 or the 2 seed, you've earned the right to not play your best in the first round because you're just significantly better than the team you're matching up against. You've earned the right to not shoot particularly well or not defend especially well, maybe struggle to transition into playoff basketball at times, and you might drop 1, maybe 2 games in the first round, but it's really unlikely that even if you don't play at the top of your game, that you're actually going to lose the series. But when you're playing this Brooklyn team, even with all of their flaws, which we're going to get to in a second, if they shoot the basketball well, and if Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving are on, they can win any individual game in any individual series strictly from a talent perspective, and that is unheard of for a team that is seeded this low and is going to be playing Boston potentially in the first round. And you don't have to believe me and believe my argument. You can look at what other teams are doing. There's been a concerted effort over the last week or so, specifically for Milwaukee in their final game of the regular season, to not have to play against this Brooklyn team in the first round. So even if you don't believe that they're that scary, or you don't respect this team as much as an underdog in the playoffs, and I wouldn't blame you if you didn't, but just look at what the other teams are doing as evidence. However, there is of course a reason why this team is a 7 seed and why they're not one of the top records in the East. Partially, it's because of injuries, Kyrie being in and out of the lineup, KD missing time, Joe Harris missing most of the season, Ben Simmons has yet to even play for this team. That has caused a ton of struggles in terms of continuity and learning how to play together, and it is very much a team that you're just kind of throwing together out there, especially if Simmons returns, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. And then when you start to look at some of the matchups, there are definitely some issues for Brooklyn as well. Bam for Miami has done a pretty good job of guarding KD this season. He has a unique combination of length and quickness and size and effort that can bother KD. And if you make KD inefficient, it makes it much easier to deal with this Brooklyn team. And then Boston, their likely first round opponent, they have a ton of bigger guards and bigger wings that are going to be difficult for Brooklyn to match up with personnel-wise. Same thing with Milwaukee. They have a giant team that they can put out there between Middleton, Holiday, Giannis, Lopez, and then whoever else they want to put on the floor. They can force Seth Curry and Kyrie and Patty Mills, whoever's on the floor in the backcourt, to have to guard one of Drew Holiday or Chris Middleton. And in the post, those guys are going to get absolutely destroyed, much less having to deal with whatever the Giannis matchup is going to be, whether that be Blake Griffin, whether that be Ben Simmons, whether that be KD, whether it be Nick Claxton. There's a lot of question marks there. And then for Philly, obviously Embiid is going to be a gigantic issue, as he is for every team, but specifically for Brooklyn that has one center in Claxton that's too skinny to guard him, and one in Drummond that's big enough but not good enough defensively. And so it's clear that even though they are a scary team, they're not flawless by any means. There's a reason they're the 7th seed. There's a reason they have one of the worst defensive ratings in the league across the entire season. Personnel-wise, they're going to have difficulty matching up with every single other top team in the Eastern Conference as currently constructed, which is the looming question over all this. When it comes to matching up with Boston in the first round potentially, or Milwaukee with Giannis, they have someone that can really help them. He's just not healthy. If Ben Simmons returns for this team, defensively, it can help them a ton. You can have Kyrie out there and let Ben Simmons guard, whether it be Giannis if he's on the floor, or Middleton or Holiday if Giannis isn't on the floor. It changes everything for you defensively, because not only is he a unique player in general, but specifically for this roster, he's the only guy that they have that is on that level defensively and has that kind of size and length. However, that also creates its own problems. How on earth are you supposed to integrate a guy that hasn't played all season, that has not played at all in general because he was sitting out, and then also over the last month or so hasn't played as a result of a back injury? The last time we saw him play was in last postseason, and he ended that horribly. And then you're supposed to just expect to throw him out there in the postseason and hope he's going to give you a lift. And he's not a floor spacer, so you have to figure out how to integrate that with your roster with all these other guys, and they don't really have a ton of off-ball spacing outside of KD or Kyrie if they happen to be off the ball in that moment. And so ultimately, yeah, there's a ton of question marks around this team, and you have no idea what's going to happen from a health standpoint. We saw them break down from a health standpoint last year in the playoffs. They really don't have a ton of off-ball spacing outside of guys like Patty Mills that, one, have been inconsistent this year, and two, are really going to struggle on the defensive end. They don't actually match up super well with any of the other top 4 teams in this conference. But here's the bottom line. You have Kevin Durant, you have Kyrie Irving, and you're going to have to beat this team. They're not going to beat themselves. They're going to put themselves in a position to win these games offensively and from a shooting standpoint every single night. And if they happen to shoot the basketball well, if that level of variance goes towards the positive end for them in terms of them shooting really well from 3, you're going to have a difficult time dealing with them offensively. You might score 115 a game, but they might score 120 a game, and you might lose that series. So the bottom line is, even with all the issues, the injuries, the defense, the matchups, wondering what's going to happen with Simmons coming back or not, they are incredibly dangerous, and that is unique for them as a 7 seed. Similar to what we saw from the Lakers last year, where if AD didn't get hurt, maybe they win that first round series against Phoenix. If Brooklyn is healthy, and for example, if they're playing Boston in the first round, I don't think anybody would be surprised to see Brooklyn win that series and potentially go on and make a run to the conference finals or the finals. It's far from a guarantee, but in terms of how scary you can possibly be as a 7 seed, I don't see how it gets much scarier than this Brooklyn team.